When two completely different substances meet, they don't naturally blend. They separate, repel each other, and create immediate friction. Human cultures operate the same way. In Orlando, Florida, a telecommunications company with strong Muslim ties repeatedly warned a Catholic employee against bringing certain foods onto the premises. When she ate a bacon sandwich for lunch, they fired her, citing strict prohibitions against pork. In Kenya, a 67-year-old widow decided to marry a 25-year-old handyman. Supporters pointed to individual rights and personal choice, but the community erupted in outrage, arguing the union was a direct violation of tribal traditions and generational authority that had held their society together for centuries. And in 2003, the Egyptian government entirely banned the screening of the Hollywood blockbuster The Matrix Reloaded. Reviewers argued that the film's portrayal of a creator figure in human form was highly inappropriate for Egyptian moviegoers. Theoretical psychology mapped these differences. It explains the origins of our beliefs, our biases, and our cultural norms. But it leaves a massive vacuum regarding what we are supposed to do when these worldviews actively collide in our schools, hospitals, and legal systems. This gap is filled by applied cross-cultural psychology. The researchers in this field are scientists, not politicians. As the literature reminds us, psychologists are not magicians. They cannot wave wands to erase inequality. Instead, they attempt the grueling work of designing interventions that improve human lives without acting as cultural imperialists. The tension is perhaps most obvious in global health. Western medicine is rooted in empirical data, cell counts, lab results, and viral loads. But a massive portion of the global population relies on traditional beliefs, diagnosing illnesses as supernatural punishments or spiritual imbalances. When international agencies like the World Health Organization mandate health policies, these clashing paradigms can be deadly. In some African communities, the stigma surrounding AIDS is so intense that local doctors routinely falsify death certificates, listing tuberculosis instead to protect families. Applied psychologists working overseas quickly realize that lecturing a community about scientific reality rarely changes behavior. The accepted rule is that practitioners must work within a client's local belief system, even if they don't accept those beliefs as scientifically valid. We see this clearly in a specialized health education program developed for indigenous women living in deep poverty in rural Guatemala. Instead of importing foreign doctors to dictate rules, the program utilizes a supervised 4-stage cascade process. Specially trained local women conduct workshops for their peers. They discuss hygiene, nutrition, and even reproductive health by tying the practices directly to their own cultural concepts of self-worth and family responsibility. By bypassing the natural resistance triggered by outsider mandates, the community adopts healthier practices. True behavioral change requires giving individuals the tools to protect themselves, delivered through a cultural vocabulary they already trust. This friction extends far beyond rural clinics and into international commerce. When professionals travel for business, they often experience acculturative stress, a psychological disorientation and loss of control triggered by an unfamiliar cultural environment. This disorientation immediately surfaces at the negotiation table. As two groups sit down to strike a deal, and one comes from a culture that values passive, non-confrontational dialogue, while the other expects aggressive, direct problem-solving, the negotiation can collapse over tone of voice and body language alone. This animated matrix illustrates the psychology of conflict resolution through a model called the cooperation dilemma. Competing teams act as countries deciding between peace and war. If both declare peace, each earns $1 million. If both declare war, both lose $2 million. But if one team chooses peace and the other secretly declares war, the aggressor takes $3 million and the peaceful victim loses $1 million. Looking at this board, negotiators typically rely on two strategies to resolve the conflict. They might push for a distributive solution, making midway concessions where everyone gets a partial piece of the pie. Or they might pursue an integrative solution, a scenario where both parties find a way to benefit simultaneously without losing anything substantial. Identifying these underlying negotiation styles provides the psychological infrastructure required for international business to function, where misinterpreting a partner's silence or aggression often results in a total collapse of the deal. But applied cross-cultural psychology eventually collides with an ethical paradox. If the guiding rule is to respect local traditions, what happens when a culture's deeply held custom violates a fundamental human right? The United Nations has established a rigid system of international rights designed to guarantee a free, secure, and healthy life for everyone. Yet these universal standards frequently crash into the economic and historical realities of nations trying to survive on limited resources. The UN mandates that children have a right to an education, a standard of living, and freedom from adult interference. But in impoverished regions of Brazil or India, where millions of children begin physical labor at an early age to support their families, enforcing Western individualistic values directly threatens the survival of the group. This tension is further complicated by state censorship. Authoritarian governments routinely block information regarding human rights by claiming they are simply protecting their local community from foreign moral corruption, using culture as a shield to maintain political control. Here, the discipline draws a hard line. Applied psychology demands an open mind, but it does not demand accepting everything. Practitioners are instructed to actively condemn traditions involving systematic abuse, racism, and violence, regardless of how long those customs have been in place. Cross-cultural psychologists do not carry the authority of lawmakers or judges. They cannot force a government to pass a bill, and they cannot magically dissolve international conflict. What they do is build a policy climate. Through relentless research, published data, and precise program design, they slowly influence public opinion. They dismantle local stereotypes and provide the structural blueprints that institutions eventually use to implement reform. Whether we are attempting to treat an infectious disease, negotiate a trade agreement, or draft international laws, we have to recognize the ecological and cultural context of the people involved. Imposing an outside solution rarely works. The solution has to make sense to the people executing it. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu wrote that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Navigating the extreme differences of a globalized world is an agonizingly slow, complicated process. We don't have all the answers for the cultural collision yet, but understanding the complex, deeply rooted psychology behind our differences is the only way we can take that first step.